Hello everybody, I hope your Christmas preparations are going according to plan. I wanted to squeeze another one in before Christmas, and this is Granny's GodPod number 109, Mark the Evangelist. Although closely associated with Peter and Paul, Mark was not one of the original 12 disciples. He was a believer in the early church, mentioned directly only in the book of Acts, originally known as John Mark. John was his Hebrew or Semitic name, while Mark was his Greco-Roman name. It was common for Jews in the Roman world to have two such names, allowing them to navigate different cultures. Mark was often preferred in Gentile, that's non-Jewish, contexts, because John was an extremely common name, and since his main ministry was to the Gentiles, it would make sense that the Roman name Mark became more prominent in his interactions and writings. According to Coptic tradition, John Mark was born in Cyrene, North Africa, the same place Simon came from who helped Jesus carry his cross. We first hear of John Mark in Acts 12:12, when Peter was miraculously released from prison and sought refuge at the house of Mary, where many were gathered together praying. This Mary was the mother of John, who was also called Mark, and her house was a safe house for Christians in Jerusalem. So I think it's safe to assume that John Mark knew Peter at this time. This was before Paul's first missionary journey. Being known as Mary's house suggests that her husband had died. Peter, in 1 Peter 5:13, refers to Mark as his son, and when an apostle refers to a person who is not literally a relative in this way, it usually means he brought him to faith in the Lord. He may even have baptized him. This also happens with other apostles. Colossians 4:1 tells us John Mark and Barnabas were cousins. Acts 12:25 tells us John, who was also called Mark, went on a mission with Barnabas and Saul. In Acts 13:5, we are told that Barnabas and Paul had John as their helper. But in Acts 13:13, he returned home. There is an incident in Galatians 2:11-21, where Paul admonishes Peter for his hypocrisy and wrong behaviour with the Gentiles. Galatians 2:13 tells us even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. I wonder if this contributed to Mark abandoning Paul on that missionary journey, but we are not told why. Later on, in Acts 15:37 and 39, Paul refuses to have John called Mark accompany him. So Barnabas takes Mark with him to Cyprus. This is the last time his first name John is used. In the rest of Acts, he is only referred to as Mark. In Paul's letters to the Colossians and Philemon, he is simply Mark. The simple use of Mark by key figures suggests he was a well-known figure. In Philemon 23:24, Paul refers to Mark as a fellow worker, just as he does Luke. The last mention of Mark is in 2 Timothy 4:11, when Paul asks Timothy to bring Mark, who is useful to him for service. So they obviously made up after their initial altercation. Eusebius, the bishop of Caesarea in the 3rd century, in his ecclesiastical history 111.39.14-15 reports that Papias, a disciple of the Apostle John, attributes Mark as the author of the Gospel, having become the interpreter of Peter, saying he wrote down accurately, although not in order, what he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. Papias says that Mark neither heard nor followed the Lord, but followed Peter, and neither omitted any of the things that he had heard, nor stated any of them falsely. Richard Bolcom, page 28 in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, notes that this was a standard formula used by translators. Mark is delivering to us the oral teaching of Peter, a primary source and eyewitness testimony. It is possible that Peter would speak in Aramaic and Mark would translate for Greek-speaking audiences. Or it could be that in Peter's oral preaching he used his rough and ready Greek, or even explained things to Mark in Aramaic, but preferred Mark to write it down in a more accurate and readable Greek. Mark was traditionally known as the author of the Gospel of Mark and a companion to the Apostle Peter, which is supported by Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria. In fact, Justin Martyr, writing about the middle of the 2nd century, actually refers to Mark's Gospel as the memoirs of Peter. It has been suggested that Mark was the young man who fled naked from the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested, leaving behind his linen cloth. Richard Bolcom, page 197, says the incident is unlikely to have been observed by the other disciples or to come from members of the arresting party, because their focus was more likely to be elsewhere. The young man is not named because, as an eyewitness, he needed protective anonymity, though at the time it's likely those who heard the story knew very well who he was. Why did Mark insert the story at all? It's only in his Gospel that this account appears, so maybe it's his way of telling us he was there, even though Papias tells us he neither knew nor followed Jesus. Perhaps he was simply a curious young man on the periphery at that time and took fright, scared to get caught up in something he did not fully understand. We can assume Mark was born in the 1st century AD and that he was well educated. Some sources have Mark as the first bishop of Alexandria, martyred about 68 to 72 AD, but the Bible itself leaves us guessing. So there we are, Matthew and Mark done, Luke and John for the new year. Can I wish you all a very blessed Christmas and remind you to go look for Granny's GodPod Youth GodPod number 2, Christmas on Steroids. I'll put a link below. Till next time.